Episode 34, Back to Treasure Digging. Welcome to the Hidden and Distorted History of the Church series, where we will be looking at the historical aspects of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormons. In this series, I will try and inform those unaware of the true facts of Mormon history. Recap. Last week, we delved into the financial misadventures of Joseph Smith and church leaders as they poured resources into the doomed Bank of Monroe, an investment that ultimately collapsed. We examined the hiring of Joshua Satius and how the church asserts that his teachings played a crucial role in Smith's supposed translation of the Book of Abraham. Additionally, we uncovered how Joseph distinguished between Elijah and Elias as two separate entities, despite the fact that they are, in reality, one and the same figure. This week, we dive into the intriguing journey of Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Oliver Cowdery, and Hyrum Smith as they embark on a supposed missionary mission to Salem. However, the truth reveals a different story. This trip is actually a treasure-hunting expedition shrouded in deception. We'll also take a closer look at the unfolding Fanny Alger narrative as it reaches its conclusion, examine the controversial passage of the so-called Redemption of Zion, and explore the emergence of the Kirtland Safety Society Bank. You won't want to miss this spicy episode, packed with scandal and revelation. Part 1, Old Habits Die Hard. In the summer of 1836, Joseph Smith, his brother Hyrum, Sidney Rigdon, and Oliver Cowdery journeyed to Salem, Massachusetts, ostensibly under the guise of missionary work. But the real motive wasn't conversion, it was cash. Records indicate that the true aim was to unearth a rumored treasure supposedly stashed beneath a Salem house, a desperate attempt to alleviate the church's crushing financial burdens. At this time, Smith and his associates faced substantial debt due to ambitious projects in Kirtland, Ohio, including the expensive construction of the Kirtland Temple and the ill-fated speculative banking venture of the Kirtland Safety Society. By now, Smith's finances were nearly exhausted, and the pressure to find funds was urgent. The legend of hidden treasure reportedly came to Smith from a church member, Jonathan Burgess, who claimed that a fortune lay buried in a Salem home. Smith, already no stranger to treasure-seeking from his early days in New York, saw an opportunity in the story. He framed the trip as a missionary journey to justify its expenses to his followers, but those closest to him understood the real goal: to retrieve the treasure and save the church from financial ruin. During their stay in Salem, Smith claimed to receive a revelation on August 6, 1836, now recorded in Doctrine and Covenants 1:11. In it, God reassures Smith that there is much treasure in store, not just monetary wealth, but also in people whom I will gather. This cryptic revelation appears to spiritualize the treasure, suggesting that God's true intent was to find converts rather than gold, an interpretation that conveniently softened the disappointment when the treasure failed to materialize. Ultimately, Smith's Salem venture proved a failure. They found no buried fortune and returned to Kirtland empty-handed, but this escapade fueled criticism against Smith, with detractors accusing him of exploiting his followers with supernatural claims to justify impractical, financially disastrous pursuits. The church downplays the episode as a failed missionary journey, but the facts reveal it as a failed treasure hunt, plain and simple. Smith's letter to Emma on August 19, 1836, reveals his fixation on this treasure, even though the church was in a financial crisis. "We have found the house, very luckily and providentially, as we have one spell been most discouraged. The house is occupied, and it will require much care and patience to rent or buy it." Incredibly, despite the church's dire finances, here was Smith talking about spending even more money in hopes of securing this elusive fortune, a move that threatened to drag the church deeper into debt. Even Fair concedes that this was a treasure-seeking expedition. Hearing that a large amount of money would be available to them in Salem, the prophet Sidney Rigdon, Hyrum Smith, and Oliver Cowdery traveled there from Kirtland, Ohio, to investigate this claim. Fair admits that Smith and his companions, once realizing there was no treasure, abandoned their supposed missionary purpose and simply left Salem, leaving no evidence of any real intent to convert anyone. This confession undermines the church's narrative that the trip was primarily about proselytizing. Historically, this Salem venture underscores Smith's enduring connection to treasure-seeking and reveals the lengths he was willing to go to secure funds under the guise of religious mission. The pattern of treasure hunting, woven through his early practices, later bled into doctrinal revelations. The Salem trip starkly illustrates Smith's opportunistic blending of speculative, profit-driven schemes with his religious mission whenever circumstances allowed. Part 2. Fanny Sent Packing. In September 1836, Fanny Alger moved to Missouri, and it is commonly understood that this move was, at least in part, a result of Emma Smith's influence. It has been suggested that Emma wanted Fanny out of the immediate vicinity to help ease the tension within their household and the broader church community. After moving to Missouri, Fanny Alger continued to live in the midst of the growing Latter-day Saint community. This move marked a transition in her life, as she navigated her status within the church, amid the backdrop of Joseph's evolving marital practices and the church's challenge. Emma's alleged accusation of Fanny being pregnant out of wedlock could have served as a convenient justification for sending her away. By framing Fanny's departure in terms of scandal, Emma could distance herself from the polygamous relationship while preserving her own reputation and that of Joseph within the church community. Historians such as Dan Vogel, Carrie B. Winward, Todd Compton, and Greg Cofford have pointed out that there is no concrete evidence to support the claim that Fanny Alger was actually pregnant at the time of her departure. This lack of evidence raises questions about the motivations behind Emma's actions and the truth of her claim. Part 3. Another failed revelation. Spring 1834, in a bold declaration that would reverberate through the early history of the Latter-day Saints, Joseph Smith prophesied to the members of Zion's camp that within 3 years they should march to Jackson County, and there should not be a dog to open his mouth against them. Reed Peck Manuscript, p. 3. This proclamation was not just a hopeful promise. It was a calculated assertion meant to galvanize the saints, who were navigating the complex and often hostile landscape of frontier America. By this time, tensions had escalated significantly between the Mormons and local settlers in Missouri. The church's presence was controversial, and Smith's rhetoric often inflamed hostilities. Publications from church leaders compared their community to biblical Jerusalem and portrayed themselves as God's chosen army destined to reclaim the land. This aggressive stance did little to endear them to their neighbors, leading to widespread resentment and ultimately violent confrontations. Fast forward to September 11, 1836. The date Joseph Smith had designated for the redemption of Zion approached, and many church members found themselves filled with anticipation. They had endured years of hardship, believing this day would signify the culmination of their struggles, a moment when they would reclaim their sacred lands in Jackson County. However, as the day came and went without any divine intervention or miraculous event, disappointment settled heavily over the congregation. The failure of this anticipated redemption not only shattered their hopes but also sparked significant doubt about Smith's claims. Church members were left to confront the reality that the prophecy had not materialized. Questions began to arise. What kind of leadership were they following? Had they been misguided in their faith? The absence of any divine sign led to increased scrutiny of Smith's role as a so-called prophet and the church's teachings. The events of September 1836 further exposed the fragility of Joseph Smith's prophetic claims. Not only had he failed to deliver on the promise made to the members of Zion's camp, but this latest disappointment led many to reevaluate their beliefs. Smith's authority, once taken for granted, became a point of contention within the church. Followers began to question whether they had placed their faith in a genuine prophetic figure or a charismatic leader who often promised more than he could deliver. This scrutiny was not unfounded. The history of the church was riddled with unfulfilled prophecies and proclamations that had failed to come to fruition. The ideal of Zion, heavily emphasized by Smith, transformed from a beacon of hope to a symbol of the church's struggles and failures. The rhetoric of restoration and divine favor clashed harshly with the reality of persistent persecution and unfulfilled promises. Despite the setbacks, the idea of Zion remained a powerful motivator for many church members. Even after the disappointment of 1836, the The dream of establishing a promised land persisted, though it was now tinged with the bitterness of broken expectations. Smith's emphasis on the restoration of Zion would continue to shape the church's identity and aspirations, even as members grappled with the implications of his failed prophecies. In the following years, the Latter-day Saints would briefly resettle in Jackson County, attempting to reclaim their identity and lands. However, the shadow of disappointment loomed large. The failures of both Zion's camp and the 1836 prophecy served as stark reminders of the perilous nature of prophetic claims and the struggles of a community striving for legitimacy in a hostile environment. Part 4. The Kirtland Safety Society. By 1836, Joseph Smith and other church leaders were grappling with crippling debt stemming from the costly Kirtland Temple, unpaid land obligations, and various financial liabilities. To address these overwhelming setbacks, they made a risky investment in the Bank of Monroe, a venture that only exacerbated the church's financial troubles. In a desperate bid for survival and with Kirtland's population burgeoning, church leaders launched the Kirtland Safety Society, an unlicensed institution they hoped would alleviate their fiscal burdens by operating as a quasi-bank. The modern LDS Church portrays the Kirtland Safety Society as a genuine attempt to support its members, framing the venture as part of the goal of economic growth, with religious purposes, to expand the city as a gathering place for converts, to help saints in Missouri who had been driven from their homes, to spread the gospel, and ultimately to establish Zion. However, this narrative conveniently glosses over the church's dire financial reality. Most of the members were financially strapped, and the leadership was already harassing the wealthy for money, which they were increasingly unwilling to provide. Could one blame them? Joseph had been hoarding the members' property under the law of consecration, and when the United Order collapsed, he retained much of that property. Is it any wonder that members were hesitant to give more money? To kickstart the bank, Orson Hyde was purportedly sent to Columbus, Ohio, to seek a charter from the legislature, while Oliver Cowdery traveled to Philadelphia to acquire printing plates for the banknotes. However, Hyde failed to reach Columbus on time, primarily due to the chaos and urgency surrounding the Kirtland Safety Society's establishment. Effectively, they had no money to send him, combined with personal delays and logistical obstacles. When the Ohio legislature ultimately rejected their petition for a bank charter, Smith turned to his most reliable recourse, so-called revelation. He claimed to have received a divine instruction to create a banking anti-banking institution. In a bid to sidestep legal restrictions, the bank's name was modified on the notes to read Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company, with Sidney Rigdon serving as president and Smith as cashier. Despite its shaky foundation, the notes initially circulated among the community, and Smith's followers were urged to maintain faith in his inspired vision. Yet as more sophisticated non-Mormon merchants began redeeming the notes, it became painfully evident that the venture was financially unviable. Within months, Smith and Rigdon resigned from their posts, passing control to other church members. By the time the Kirtland Safety Society closed its doors in November 1837, it was staggering. Approximately $100,000 in unresolved debt loomed over the operation, a colossal loss for the church. Some skeptics believed that the Kirtland Safety Society was a scheme from the outset. Legal battles erupted, resulting in fines of $1,000 each for Smith and Rigdon for running an illegal bank. Meanwhile, other church leaders urged holders of the nearly worthless notes to retain them, speculating they might one day regain value. The LDS Church's modern portrayal attempts to recast the Kirtland Safety Society as a well-meaning initiative for community growth, obscuring the growing debt, desperate financial struggles, and legal troubles that plagued the venture from the beginning. The church's leadership continued to demand donations from already strapped members, even as Smith was accumulating land and property through the law of consecration and keeping it after the United Order's collapse. The Kirtland Safety Society didn't even have enough capital to function properly, raising the critical question, how did the church obtain the funds it claims were raised? I won't delve into the details of its inevitable failure just yet, as that's tied to significant events in 1838 and the next few chapters of this tumultuous story. So, if you're curious about what's next, stay tuned for more in the upcoming episode. In this episode, we uncovered the tangled web of deception woven by Joseph Smith and his associates as they disguised their treasure-seeking endeavors as missionary work in Salem. We examined Fanny Alger's controversial departure and the failed prophetic promises surrounding the redemption of Zion. Additionally, the Kirtland Safety Society's financial collapse highlighted the precarious nature of Smith's leadership. Please watch for future videos, and thank you so kindly for watching. This is the Ex-Mormon Informant signing off for the day.